The throne room of the Velanthe Empire stretched across 3 kilometers of crystal and light, and at its heart sat the Empress Sivarath, a being who had lived for 12,000 years and feared nothing in all the known universe. She was not flesh and blood like the lesser races. She was woven from starlight and ancient power, her form shifting between solid and ethereal as her mood changed, and today her mood was one of cold disdain. Before her stood the human ambassador, a small creature wrapped in a simple gray uniform, and the Empress could not help but feel a flicker of something close to pity. "You offer your soldiers as guardians for my daughter," the Empress said, her voice echoing through dimensions that mortal ears could not perceive. "But I must ask why I would accept such a gift." The ambassador, a woman named Director Chen, did not flinch or bow lower than protocol required, and this small act of spine surprised the Empress more than she would ever admit. "Your Radiance," Director Chen replied. "The Hollow Synod has made 3 attempts on royal bloodlines this year alone, and they specifically target heirs during regenerative stasis cycles when your Praetorian constructs are at their lowest alertness." "My constructs are never at low alertness," the Empress interrupted, but there was a note of uncertainty buried deep beneath her pride. "They are machines, your Radiance, magnificent machines built for war, but machines nonetheless," Director Chen continued without hesitation. "And the Synod has learned their patterns, their algorithms, their predictable responses to threat." The Empress leaned forward on her throne of compressed starlight, and for the first time in centuries, she felt the cold touch of doubt. "What makes your humans different from machines," she demanded, "when they are even more fragile, even more temporary, even more likely to fail?" Director Chen smiled then, and it was not a pleasant smile, but rather the expression of someone who knew a secret the universe had not yet learned. "We are different, your Radiance, because we are afraid." In the gardens of the Imperial Palace, Princess Illithri sat among flowers that had been genetically crafted to sing in harmonies that pleased the Velanthe ear, and she did not know that her fate was being decided in the throne room above. She was young by her people's standards, merely 400 years old, and she still possessed the curiosity that her mother had long ago sacrificed to the demands of rule. When the human soldiers arrived 3 days later, Illithri watched them from her balcony with eyes that glowed soft violet in the fading light of the 3 suns. There were 6 of them, and they moved nothing like the Praetorian constructs she had known all her life. The constructs marched in perfect synchronization, their movements calculated to the microsecond, their formations mathematical in their precision, but these humans, these strange soft creatures, moved like water flowing around stones. Their leader was a man called Commander Elias Vance, and Illithri studied him as one might study a fascinating insect discovered in the garden. He was old by human standards, she had been told, with gray touching his dark hair at the temples and lines carved deep around his eyes, but he moved with a quiet efficiency that made her Praetorian guards seem clumsy by comparison. "They will not last a month," her mother had said when she informed Illithri of the arrangement, "but the political gesture is necessary to maintain our alliance with the Terran Confederacy." Illithri had simply nodded, but privately she wondered what it must feel like to be a creature that measured its entire existence in mere decades. The first night they stood guard outside her chambers, Illithri could not enter her regenerative stasis. Something about their presence unsettled her, though she could not identify what it was, and finally her curiosity drove her from her sleeping alcove to the door of her chambers. Commander Vance stood there in the soft blue glow of the palace lights, and when she opened the door he turned to face her with an expression of alert calm. "Is something wrong, Your Highness?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear in the night silence. "You are still standing," Illithri said, and even to her own ears her voice sounded confused. "Do you not need to enter stasis? Do you not need to regenerate?" Vance's expression shifted into something she did not recognize, and later she would learn that humans called this expression a smile. "Humans do not enter stasis, Your Highness," he explained patiently. "We sleep, but not all at once, and not when someone needs protecting." "You sleep individually," Illithri repeated, trying to understand this alien concept. "But when do you all rest together? When do you allow yourselves to be vulnerable?" "We do not, Your Highness," Vance replied simply. "Not when we are on duty, not when someone has been placed in our care." Illithri stared at him for a long moment, and something in her ancient young heart stirred with an emotion she could not name. "That sounds exhausting," she finally said. "It is, Your Highness," Vance agreed, and his smile grew a fraction wider. "But that is what we signed up for." She returned to her chambers that night but still could not sleep, and through the door she could hear the soft sounds of the humans changing their watch, quiet footsteps, murmured words, the subtle shift of bodies that never truly rested. On her homeworld of Earth, Vance had told her the next morning when she asked, humans had evolved as prey animals first and predators second. They had lived in a world filled with creatures that wanted to eat them, on a planet that regularly tried to kill them with earthquakes and floods and ice ages and fires, and they had survived not because they were strong, but because they learned to watch each other's backs. "We take turns," Vance had explained while his team set up their equipment in her outer chambers. "One watches while the others rest, and then we switch, and this way someone is always alert, always ready, always watching." "But your constructs could do this more efficiently," Illithri pointed out, gesturing toward the Praetorian units that stood motionless along the walls. Vance had looked at the constructs with an expression she could not read, and when he turned back to her his eyes held something deep and old and strangely sad. "Machines do not care if you live or die, Your Highness," he said softly. "They follow their programming because they have no choice, but we choose to be here, and that choice makes all the difference." Illithri thought about his words for many days afterward, turning them over in her mind like precious gems, and slowly she began to understand what the humans meant when they spoke of duty and honor and sacrifice. But she did not truly understand, not yet, not until the night the shadows came alive and her world changed forever. The weeks passed slowly in the Crystal Palace, and Princess Illithri found herself drawn again and again to the company of her human guardians. At first she told herself it was merely curiosity, the same impulse that had driven her to study extinct species and forgotten languages, but as time went on she realized it was something more. The humans fascinated her in ways she could not explain. She learned their names one by one, sitting with them during their meal times and watching with horrified fascination as they consumed dead organic matter. There was Sergeant Yuki Tanaka, a small woman with dark hair and quick hands who wrote poetry in a language called Japanese and laughed like wind chimes when something amused her. There was Private Marcus Webb, a large man with skin the color of dark wood and a smile that could light up the darkest corridor, who carried pictures of his daughter in a small metal case over his heart. There was Corporal Amara Osai, tall and graceful with eyes that missed nothing, who had grown up in a place called Ghana and spoke of her homeland with a longing that made Illithri's heart ache. There was Private First Class Daniel Morrison, young and eager with red hair that stuck up at odd angles, who asked more questions about Velanthi culture than any other human Illithri had ever met. There was Specialist Rosa Vasquez, quiet and steady with scars on her hands from a war Illithri did not understand, who hummed old songs while she cleaned her weapons in the evening light. And there was Commander Elias Vance, who watched over them all with the tired, patient eyes of someone who had seen too much, and yet still chose to see more. "Tell me about Earth," Illithri asked one evening as she sat with the off-duty guards in their small common area. It was not proper for a princess to spend time in servants' quarters, her mother would have said. But Illithri had long ago stopped caring about what was proper. Marcus Webb laughed his deep, rumbling laugh and pulled out his data pad to show her pictures of a world that seemed impossibly chaotic. "This is a hurricane," he said, pointing to a swirling mass of white clouds that covered half a continent. "This is what happens when our ocean gets angry." "Your ocean gets angry," Illithri repeated slowly, certain she had misunderstood. "Well, not angry exactly," Yuki Tanaka explained, leaning over to look at the pictures. "But our planet has weather systems that can destroy entire cities in a matter of hours." Illithri felt her eyes widen as the humans took turns showing her images of their homeworld. Volcanoes that spewed liquid rock into the sky, waves that rose higher than buildings, cracks in the ground that swallowed roads and homes whole. "And you evolved on this planet," she said when they had finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "You survived all of this." "Not all of us," Vance said quietly from the doorway where he had been watching. "Our history is full of mass extinctions, civilizations that rose and fell, entire species that vanished because they could not adapt." "But you survived," Illithri said again, turning to look at him. "We survived because we learned to fear," Vance replied, coming to sit among his soldiers with the easy familiarity of a family gathering. "And then we learned to use that fear as fuel." He explained to her then about the thing humans called adrenaline, a chemical their bodies produced when they sensed danger, a substance that could make them faster and stronger and more alert than they had any right to be. "It was meant to help us run away," Rosa Vasquez added, "but we learned to use it to stand and fight instead." "You run toward danger," Illithri said slowly, trying to wrap her mind around the concept. "Your bodies tell you to flee, but you choose to stay." "Every time," Daniel Morrison said proudly, his young face shining with conviction. "That is what makes us human." That night Illithri lay in her sleeping alcove and thought about what the humans had told her, and for the first time she began to understand why they were different from the Praetorian constructs. The constructs did not feel fear because they could not feel anything. They were tools, magnificently crafted tools, but tools nonetheless. The humans felt fear with every fiber of their being, fear woven into their very biology, and yet they chose to stand guard anyway. She thought about Marcus Webb and his daughter, how he had left behind a child he might never see again to stand in a palace on a world light years from home. She thought about Yuki Tanaka writing poetry in the quiet hours of the night, creating beauty in the moments between watching for death. She thought about Elias Vance, who had served in the military for 30 years and was only 13 days from something called retirement when he accepted this mission. "Why did you come here?" she had asked him once. "You could be home now, safe, resting after a lifetime of service." Vance had been quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke his voice was soft and rough around the edges. "Because you needed someone, Your Highness," he said simply, "and I was available." "That is not an answer," Illithri had pushed. "There must be something more, some reason why you would leave everything behind." Vance had looked at her, then with those tired ancient eyes that seemed so out of place in his young mortal face. "We are not like you, Your Highness," he said carefully. "We do not have thousands of years to make our mark on the universe. We have decades if we are lucky, and for someone like me, those decades are almost gone." "Does that not make you want to preserve them?" Illithri asked. "Does that not make you want to hold on to every moment you have left?" "It makes me want to spend those moments doing something that matters," Vance replied. "And protecting you matters, Your Highness. Protecting anyone matters, because every life we save is a victory against the darkness." Illithri did not sleep that night either, but this time it was not because of confusion or unsettlement. This time it was because she was beginning to feel something for these strange, fragile creatures, something that felt dangerously close to admiration. In her long life she had known warriors of 100 different species, beings of immense power who could crack planets and command fleets, but none of them had ever impressed her the way these 6 humans did. They were small and weak and temporary, creatures who would blink out of existence in the time it took her to read a moderately long book, and yet they stood between her and the darkness without hesitation. She was still thinking about them when the alarms began to scream. The Hollow Synod had planned their attack for 17 years. They had studied the Velanthi Palace, mapped its corridors and security systems, learned the patterns of the Praetorian constructs down to the microsecond, and they had waited with the patience of creatures who existed partially outside of normal space and time. When they finally struck, they struck with overwhelming force. The first wave came through the walls themselves, phase shifting through solid crystal as if it were nothing more than smoke, and the Praetorian constructs did not even have time to raise their weapons. Illithri heard the screams first, distant howls of energy as her mechanical guardians were torn apart by enemies they could not see, and then she heard something else, the sound of human voices, sharp and urgent, cutting through the chaos. "Contact front, contact rear, we are surrounded," someone was shouting, and she recognized the voice as Corporal Amara Os. "Morrison Vasquez, hold the corridor," Vance's voice came next, calm and steady despite the situation. "Webb Tanaka with me, we are getting the princess out." Illithri was already moving when her door burst open, but it was not an enemy who came through. It was Marcus Webb, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning every shadow in her room. "Your Highness, please come with us right now," he said, and there was no request in his voice, only command. She did not argue. There was something in his tone that told her now was not the time for questions. They moved through the palace like ghosts, Tanaka in front, Webb behind, Vance at her side with one hand on her arm to guide her in the darkness. The power had failed in this section, and the only light came from the weapons the humans carried and the distant glow of fires burning where the attack had begun. "What are they?" Illithri whispered as they pressed against a wall, waiting for Tanaka to clear the next junction. "Hollow Synod assassins," Vance replied quietly. "Phase shifters, they exist between dimensions, they can move through solid matter at will." "Then how can you fight them?" Illithri asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Vance's expression was grim in the flickering light. "With difficulty," he admitted, "but we have trained for this, we knew they might come, and we have ways." A sound came from behind them, a wet tearing noise that made Illithri's blood run cold, and Webb spun around with his weapon raised. The creature that emerged from the wall was nightmare-given form, a thing of shadows and angles that hurt to look at, with too many limbs and eyes that burned like cold stars. Webb fired without hesitation, his weapon blazing with light that had been specifically tuned to interact with phase-shifted matter, and the creature screamed in a voice that echoed through multiple dimensions. But there were more behind it, so many more, pouring through the walls like water through a broken dam. "Run," Webb shouted, stepping forward to meet them. "Get her out of here, I will hold them." "Marcus," Vance started to say, but Webb cut him off. 13 days to retirement, Commander," Marcus said with that brilliant smile. "But this is more important, go now, that is an order from a friend." They ran. Illithri heard the sounds of the battle behind them as they fled, Marcus Webb's weapon firing again and again, his voice raised in defiance, and then the terrible silence that followed. She wanted to stop, wanted to go back, but Vance's hand on her arm was like iron and he would not let her slow down. "He knew what he was doing," Vance said as they ran, and his voice was rough with grief he could not afford to feel. "He chose this, we all chose this." They made it to the secondary access corridor before the next wave found them. This time it was Yuki Tanaka who stepped forward, the small woman who wrote poetry and laughed like wind chimes, and her face was set in an expression of terrible peace. "The door ahead needs someone to manually hold it open from this side," she said calmly. "The security lockdown has engaged. Without someone here, you will not get through." Tanaka, find another way, Vance demanded. But even as he spoke, they could all hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer. There is no other way, Commander, Tanaka replied, and she was already moving toward the door controls. It takes 11 minutes for the manual override to complete. You need to be on the other side when it finishes. 11 minutes, Illithri realized, her heart breaking in her chest. This woman was offering to stand alone against those monsters for 11 minutes. Go, Tanaka said, and her voice was gentle now, the voice of the poet she had always been. I will watch the darkness for you, princess, just as I always have. They went. Behind them, Illithri heard Yuki Tanaka begin to sing, an old Earth song in that language called Japanese, her voice rising pure and clear above the sounds of approaching death. The door sealed behind them and the singing stopped, but Illithri knew she would hear that song in her dreams for the rest of her long life. They found Rosa Vasquez waiting at the next junction, her face gray with pain, her uniform dark with blood that was not hers and some that was. The others, Vance asked, and his voice cracked on the words. Morrison went down holding the east corridor, Rosa replied, her breath coming in short gasps. He took 4 of them with him before. She did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. Can you move? Vance asked, already pulling her arm over his shoulder. I can move as long as I have to, Rosa said fiercely. Now let us get the hell out of here. They made it another 100 meters before the final ambush. The phase shifter that appeared before them was larger than the others, more solid somehow, and Illithri recognized it as a commander by the way the shadows seemed to bow to its presence. Rosa raised her weapon, but the creature was faster, driving a blade of solidified darkness through her chest before she could fire. She fell, but as she fell she grabbed the creature's arm and held on with all the strength left in her dying body. Now, Commander, she gasped, blood bubbling on her lips, take the shot. Vance fired and the creature screamed, and Rosa Vasquez closed her eyes with a smile on her face. They were alone now, just Vance and Illithri, and behind them the sounds of pursuit were growing closer once again. Your team, Illithri said, and she realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face in rivers of violet light. They did their duty, Vance replied, and his voice was steady even though his eyes were bright with unshed grief. Now I am going to do mine. He led her through the final corridor to the emergency bunker, and when the last phase shifter emerged from the shadows to block their path, Elias Vance stepped forward with nothing but a knife in his hand. You will die, the creature said in a voice like broken glass. Yes, Vance agreed, and he smiled, but not before you. The Empress Sivarath arrived with 3 battle fleets at her back, 12,000 years of fury burning in her starlight form, and she tore through what remained of the hollow synod forces like a god descending upon mortals. She found her daughter in the emergency bunker, alive and unharmed, wrapped in a jacket that was several sizes too large and stained with human blood. Illithri sat in the corner of the bunker with her knees drawn up to her chest, her hands clutching a small chain of metal tags that she would not let go of, and when the Empress reached for her daughter, the princess flinched away. Do not touch me, Illithri whispered, and her voice was raw from crying. Not yet, please, I need a moment. The Empress did not understand, could not understand, what had happened in the hours before her arrival. She had expected to find her daughter traumatized perhaps, shaken by the attack, but this broken creature wrapped in a dead man's coat was something she had never anticipated. The human survivors, she demanded of her adjutant, how many remain? 1, your radiance, the adjutant replied carefully, Corporal Amara Os. She was found in the secondary corridor with 17 phase shifter corpses around her. She is in critical condition, but the medical team believes she will survive. 1 survivor out of 6, the Empress thought, and she felt something stir in her ancient heart that might have been respect. And the others, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dead, your radiance, all of them. They fell defending the princess. Illithri made a sound then, a small wounded noise like an animal in pain, and she pressed her face against the jacket she wore and breathed deeply. "This belonged to Commander Vance," she said softly, her words muffled by the fabric. "He gave it to me when we reached the bunker. He said I was shivering. He said I needed to stay warm." The Empress stared at her daughter, trying to understand why the death of a handful of primitive creatures would cause such distress. "They were doing their duty," she said finally. "They died in service to the Empire. They will be honored accordingly." "Honored?" Illithri repeated, and when she looked up her eyes were blazing with something that might have been anger. "You want to honor them?" "Is that not appropriate?" the Empress asked, genuinely confused by her daughter's reaction. "Tell me their names," Illithri demanded, rising to her feet with the jacket still clutched around her shoulders. "Tell me who they were. Tell me about their families, their dreams, their hopes for the future they will never have." The Empress blinked, and for the first time in millennia she found herself at a loss for words. "I do not know their names," she admitted slowly. "They were assigned to your protection detail. I did not think." "You did not think they mattered," Illithri finished for her, and her voice was cold now, cold as the void between stars. "They were just tools to you, just another set of guardians to be used and discarded." Illithri. "Their names were Elias Vance and Yuki Tanaka and Marcus Webb and Rosa Vasquez and Daniel Morrison and Amara Osai," Illithri recited, each name falling from her lips like a prayer. "They were people, mother, real people with lives and loves, and everything they left behind to come here and protect me." She held up the metal tags in her hand, the dog tags that Vance had pressed into her palm in his final moments. "Marcus Webb had a daughter," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "Her name is Lily and she is 7 years old and she will grow up without a father because he died holding a door so that I could escape." The Empress stood very still as her daughter spoke. "Yuki Tanaka wrote poetry," Illithri said, "beautiful poetry about the stars and the silence between them, and she sang while she died, mother. She sang so that I would not hear her screaming." "Daughter, please." "Daniel Morrison was 23 years old," Illithri continued relentlessly. "He had never even been off Earth before this mission. He asked me 100 questions about our culture because he wanted to understand. He wanted to learn, and now he will never learn anything again." The Empress felt something crack inside her, something old and cold and carefully maintained, and she realized with dawning horror that her daughter was right. She had not thought of the humans as people. She had thought of them as political tokens, as temporary measures to satisfy an alliance, as creatures so brief and fragile that learning their names would be a waste of time. "Rosa Vasquez had scars on her hands from a war I do not understand," Illithri said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But she told me once that every scar was a reminder of someone she had saved, and she was proud of them, proud of every mark." "And Commander Vance," she continued, pressing the dog tags against her heart. "Elias Vance was 13 days from retirement. Mother, 13 days from going home to rest after 30 years of service, and he came here anyway." "Why?" the Empress asked, and she was surprised to hear her own voice tremble. "Why would he do that?" "Because I needed someone," Illithri replied, echoing the words Vance had spoken to her weeks ago. "Because he was available, because every life he saved was a victory against the darkness." She looked at her mother then, and the Empress saw something in her daughter's eyes that had not been there before, a depth, a weight, an understanding that came only from witnessing sacrifice. "They knew they would die," Illithri said quietly. "They always knew, every human lives with death as a constant companion, and they came here anyway. They stood between me and the darkness even though they were afraid, especially because they were afraid." The Empress was silent for a long moment, processing her daughter's words, trying to reconcile what she thought she knew about humans with what she was hearing now. I thought their mortality made them weak, she admitted finally. Their mortality is their greatest strength, Illithri replied. They do not have forever to make things right, so they make things right now. They do not have thousands of years to find meaning, so they create meaning in every moment. She looked down at the jacket she wore, at the blood that stained its fabric, at the warmth it still carried from a man who would never feel warmth again. Who watches you through the night, mother? She asked softly. When the darkness comes and the monsters creep from the shadows, who stands between you and oblivion? The Empress did not answer, but the question lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, working its way deeper with every passing moment. Later that night, she went to the medical bay where Corporal Amara Osai lay recovering from her wounds. The human was awake, her dark eyes alert despite the pain medication flowing through her system, and when she saw the Empress she tried to rise from her bed. Your Radiance, she said, her voice rough, is the princess safe? She is safe, the Empress replied, because of you and your team. Osai relaxed back against her pillows, and something like peace crossed her features. Good, she said simply, that is good. The Empress stood at the foot of the bed, studying this small, fragile creature who had killed 17 phase shifters while grievously wounded, and she felt the last of her certainties crumble to dust. Why, she asked, the same question she had asked her daughter. Why did you come here? Why did you fight so hard for someone you barely knew? Amara Osai looked at the Empress with tired eyes that had seen too much death, and she smiled. Because that is what we do, your Radiance, she said. That is what humans have always done. The Empress left the medical bay with more questions than answers, and the weight of understanding pressing heavy on her ancient heart. 3 months passed before Princess Illithri felt ready to face the Galactic Assembly. In that time she had done things no Velanthi royal had ever done before. She had traveled to Earth, had stood in a small cemetery in a place called Virginia, had watched as Marcus Webb was laid to rest beside generations of soldiers who had served before him. She had met Lily Webb, a small human child with her father's smile and her mother's grief, and she had knelt before this tiny creature and promised that Marcus Webb would never be forgotten. She had attended 5 funerals in 5 different places across a single world, and at each one she had learned something new about the humans who had died for her. Yuki Tanaka's poetry had been published after her death, a small collection that had become one of the most requested books in the Terran Confederacy. Daniel Morrison's parents had shown Illithri his room, still exactly as he had left it, covered in star charts and alien languages he had been trying to learn. Rosa Vasquez's unit had held a ceremony in her honor, and Illithri had listened to story after story about the woman who had never left anyone behind. And Elias Vance had been buried with full military honors, his casket draped in a flag that represented a species barely 1,000 years old, a species that had already spread across 100 worlds and showed no signs of stopping. Corporal Amara Osai had recovered from her wounds and had been offered a position of honor in the Velanthi Palace, but she had declined at first. My place is with my people, she had said. I am a soldier, not a diplomat. It was Illithri who had convinced her to stay, not as a servant or a guard, but as an advisor, the first human ever granted Velanthi citizenship. You understand something that we do not, Illithri had told her, and I need someone to remind me of what your people taught me. Now, standing before the Galactic Assembly, Illithri felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon her. Representatives from every major civilization in the known universe had gathered in the Great Hall, beings of light and shadow, of crystal and flesh, of forms so strange that even naming them was a challenge. The Empress sat upon her throne at the head of the chamber, and beside her stood the empty seats of the 5 humans who had died, each one draped in the flag of the Terran Confederacy. It had been Illithri's idea, a small gesture that had caused a diplomatic incident when some species objected to honoring such primitive creatures. The Empress had overruled every objection, and that more than anything told Illithri how much her mother had changed in the months since the attack. "We are gathered here," the Empress began, her voice echoing through the chamber, "to discuss the matter of the Hollow Synod and their crimes against the Empire. But before we begin, I wish to ask a question." She turned to look at her daughter, and something passed between them, an understanding that had been forged in blood and grief, and the slow, painful process of learning to see the universe differently. "Who watches you through the night?" the Empress asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "When the darkness comes and danger stalks from the shadows, who stands between you and oblivion?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Illithri felt the eyes of the assembly turn toward her. She stood slowly, the metal dog tags still hanging around her neck as they had every day since the attack, and she walked to the center of the chamber where all could see her. Beside her walked Amara Osei, the last survivor of the human protection detail, her scars visible beneath the formal uniform she wore. And behind them stood 50 human soldiers who had volunteered for the new Royal Guard, 50 men and women who had read the reports of what happened in the palace and had signed up anyway. There had been a waiting list, Illithri had learned, thousands of humans eager to stand where their fallen comrades had stood, knowing full well what that might mean. "My mother asked me this question on the night she found me," Illithri began, her voice clear and strong. "She asked who watched me through the darkness, what manner of creature stayed awake while others slept, what kind of being refused to abandon their charge even unto death." She paused, looking around the chamber at the assembled representatives of the galaxy's greatest civilizations. "I have spent my life among the most powerful beings in the universe," she continued. "I have known warriors who could shatter planets and commanders who have lived for longer than many stars. But in all my years, I had never known anyone like the 6 humans who died to save my life." She reached up and touched the dog tags at her throat. "They were small," she said, "and fragile and brief, their entire existence measured in decades rather than millennia, their bodies weak by any galactic standard, their technology primitive compared to what we possess." The assembly stirred, some with dismissal, others with growing interest. "But they had something that none of us understood," Illithri pressed on. "They had the knowledge of their own mortality, the certainty that death was coming for them whether they fought or fled, and instead of making them cowards, it made them brave beyond measure." She gestured to Amara Osei, who stepped forward with quiet dignity. "This woman killed 17 Hollow Synod phase shifters while wounded so badly that any other species would have fallen in the first moments of battle," Illithri said. "And when I asked her how, she told me that she simply refused to stop." "Humans do not stop," Illithri continued, her voice rising. "They evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day, and they survived by learning to persist beyond all reason. They followed their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They rebuilt their cities after every disaster. They reached for the stars even when they could barely reach their own moon." She turned to face her mother directly. "You asked who watches us through the night, mother," she said, "and I will tell you. The humans do." The words fell into silence, and Illithri saw something shift in the expressions of the assembled delegates. "They watch because they are afraid," she continued. "And they guard anyway. They watch because they will die, and every life they save is a victory against their own mortality. They watch because they evolved on a world that hunted them, and they learned that the only way to survive was together." She spread her arms wide, encompassing the human soldiers who stood behind her. "They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the fastest or the most advanced. They do not live long enough to learn patience, so instead they learn urgency. And in that urgency is a fire that immortals have long forgotten. We measure our lives in millennia," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper that still somehow carried to every ear. And in doing so, we forget what it means to treasure each moment. We forget what it means to fight as if every second matters, because for us seconds are endless. But for humans, she continued, every heartbeat is precious, every breath is a gift, every day alive is a victory won against the eternal darkness. She looked around the chamber one final time, at the representatives of species who had dismissed humanity as beneath notice, as too brief to matter, as temporary annoyances in a universe of eternal beings. "You asked what manner of creature does not abandon its charge even unto death," she said to her mother, "and the answer is this: the ones who know what it means to lose everything and choose to protect others anyway." The Empress rose from her throne then, and the assembly fell utterly silent. "From this day forward," the Empress declared, her voice carrying the weight of imperial decree, "the Terran Confederacy shall be recognized as full partners in the Velanthe Empire, and any who threaten humanity shall face the wrath of our combined forces." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was softer, almost gentle. "Because they watched us through the night," she said, "and we will never forget." Amara Osai stood at attention as the chamber erupted in response, and she felt tears streaming down her face, tears for her fallen friends, tears for the recognition they had earned, tears for the strange, wonderful, terrifying galaxy that was finally learning to see her people for what they truly were. Not primitives, not weaklings, not brief candles flickering in an eternal darkness, but guardians, watchmen, humanity. And as the assembly dissolved into historic chaos around her, she could almost hear Elias Vance's voice in her ear, tired and wry and proud. "Not bad for 13 days from retirement," he seemed to say, "not bad at all."